Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1205, and I will continue with this lovely book that sort of summarizes so much that we've done before and even brings it a bit further. I see strains in this book from Bujaki, David Bradel, Wittgenstein, no doubt, is mentioned. Heidegger finally gets his scientific foundation. I sincerely doubt that Heidegger would mean anything to anyone unless there is a solid scientific foundation. We earlier found one in quantum mechanics, and now we really need to add from neurology and science of cognition. Why the latter? Why is there a need for reliance on science of cognition, neurology? Well, the reason is now we are stretching into our normal daily life, and I think there is where quantum mechanics has its place. It makes the most change there in our daily perceptions of what's real or Dasein, being, and those things. So we stream to chapter 6 of the book, Early and Often. Words and grammatical constructions are the building blocks that make up utterances. They're responsible for what utterances sound or look like, and also for what and how you're going to simulate. But it isn't enough to know what the building blocks are. People actually using language also have to be able to recognize them in real time, in an utterance, and put them together. What are the processes that people actually use to deploy those building blocks? How exactly do you go from a sentence to a simulation? At first blush, this might not seem like such a hard problem. After all, if you know all the words in a sentence and the grammatical constructions that put them together, then it's just a matter of binding all the pieces together and you are good to go. How exactly do you go from a sentence to a simulation? At first blush, this might not seem like such a hard problem. Like a puzzle, there is a single correct solution. Only one way that the pieces will all click into place. Of course, with language, it's not always that simple, because it's not always easy to tell exactly what was said or written. The very words someone uttered can be unclear. Did he just say that he can take or can't ache? Or the signal can be degraded. For instance, when you're talking on the phone, or in a noisy environment. But even bearing all that, even when you know exactly what words you're dealing with, it's still not easy to put all the pieces together because of a very important and unavoidable characteristics of language. You do not get the whole utterance at the same time. When you're reading or listening to language, the words come one after the other as they're spoken or as you run your eyes across the page. And they come at a tremendous speed, around 3 or 4 per second in a normal spoken language. That means that you have 2 choices, both suboptimal. The first is that you can wait until the end of the sentence and try to figure out at that point, when all the data has come in, and what it was all about. The advantage to this strategy is that you have complete knowledge about the utterance when you make decisions. There are also disadvantages though. The big one is that you're going to be slow on the uptake. If you wait until after the utterance to try to put it together, you're only starting to understand a sentence while the speaker is already on to the next one, or waiting for you to reply or act, or whatever it is that the utterance is trying to tell you. The second choice is try to bind everything together incrementally, making decisions about what to do with each word by word, as you read or hear it. Incremental processing has the upside of allowing you to start understanding the utterance early, which, as long as nothing goes terribly wrong, means that you could potentially be keeping up with what the sentence is telling you as you go. And it has the additional advantage that if you're making best guesses about what the sentence is about as it unfurls, then as long as the sentence is pretty predictable, the things that come later are going to be less surprising and easier for you to integrate. But there is a big downside to incremental processing, and that's the fact that you're almost always dealing with incomplete knowledge. When you heard just a few words of a sentence, you can guess where it's going, but when you're wrong, it can throw you for a loop. So because language is dynamic, fitting the pieces of an utterance together is somewhat harder than it first appears. So let's begin with the question of which option people go with. Are people relatively conservative, waiting until they have a complete picture of what the utterance is before trying to put it all together? Or do they jump on each word as it comes in, trying to incrementally fit it into an ongoing best guess of what the sentence is about? As we'll see, the answer is, perhaps surprisingly, that people do both. Time flies. How can we tell whether people process language incrementally? Well, if people are making early guesses about what the sentence is about, then that means that sentences that are relatively unpredictable should cause people problems, even over the course of the sentence. Before it's over, it turns out there are such sentences. They are called garden path sentences because they lead you down a garden path. To the wrong outcome. For instance, here's a saying attributed to Groucho Marx: "Time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana." In reading the second sentence, "fruit flies like a banana," you probably mistakenly took flies to be the verb. After all, flies was a verb in the first sentence. I just had to put in parentheses here about something completely different. This is priming. This is putting you in a position to perceive. It's giving you the potentiality to have reality. Although it went wrong here, it's also an absolute condition for anything to come out of anything. This is coming from quantum mechanics. You figure that fruit was the subject, and that you were going to find how it flies. But then you got to the banana at the end and realized that no, flies wasn't a verb in this sentence, but a part of a compound noun, fruit flies. And like was actually the verb. You were duped because the second sentence did not turn out how you expected it to. Now that example is a little messy because there could be a lot of reasons why you expect flies to be the verb in the second sentence. For one, it could be that you expect the grammar of the second sentence to be like the grammar of the first. Or it could be that you just have a prior belief that flies is more likely to be a verb than a noun. But there are some cases where it's very clear what went wrong. For example, the lawyer cross-examined by the prosecutor confessed. My guess is that, like most people, when you go to the by the prosecutor part, you did a mental double take. Why is this? Well, the trick here is that lawyers tend to cross-examine people. So when you get to cross-examined, you think you figured out the structure of the sentence. The lawyer is the subject, and cross-examine is a very apt verb for it to be the subject of. But then you got to by the prosecutor and had to go back and reconsider who did what to whom. And we know that part of the reason you were so easily led astray here is that lawyers tend to do cross-examining. To prove this to yourself, read the following sentence. The witness, cross-examined by the prosecutor, confessed. This should have been much easier to understand. You might not have gotten led down a garden path at all. Research shows that it would still be easier to understand even if you hadn't just read another similar sentence. The reason has to do with our knowledge about witnesses and lawyers. We know that cross-examining is the type of thing that lawyers tend to do, not to be subjected to, although the reverse is true for the witness. This world knowledge affects our decisions about how to integrate words in the moment-by-moment activity of understanding the sentences they are part of. So it appears that the sentence understanding process uses aspect of meaning to come up with a word-by-word current best guess of what the sentence is about. But how do we know empirically that this is really happening in real time and not at the end of the sentence? One of the most productive ways to tell what's happening as people process sentences is to watch their eyes. Suppose you have people listen to sentences while looking at an array of pictures. The pictures depict various objects that differ in subtle way. For instance, some of them are edible, like a cake and an apple, while others, like a cat and a table, are not. While they're looking at these pictures, the participants hear sentences that describe people acting on objects. For instance, a sentence might be, "The boy ate the apple." When will people look where? Do people look more at edible object when they come to the word ate, even before they hear the name of the object being eaten. Once more, this is definitely priming. When researchers in the United Kingdom asked this question, they found that people looked more at the set of objects that fit with the meaning of the verb, even before they heard the name of the relevant object. For instance, they looked more at the apple and the cake than the cat and the table right when they heard ate, well before the end of the sentence. The most straightforward interpretation of this result, as well as subsequent work that has corroborated and extended it, as well as subsequent work, is that people make predictions about what the rest of the sentence will contain as soon as words they have already heard start to constrain what could reasonably follow. People start to cobble their understanding of sentences together incrementally. And this takes us to incremental simulation. But when, you might well be wondering, does simulation kick in? In principle, there are again several possibilities. People might simulate early on in an utterance, or maybe they are very stingy with simulation, waiting until all the pieces are in place, until the end of the utterance, to simulate whatever the combined story as a whole is supposed to be. You might think that the second approach, the more conservative one, would be the more efficient way to go. It might help to do at least some parsing before you start to simulate. Before you can construct an embodied simulation to accurately depict the rabid monkey is gnawing on the unconscious scientist, for example. You need to know whether the word rabid applies to the monkey or the scientist, and the same for unconscious. You also need to know what the subject is gnawing is. Is the gnawer the monkey or the scientist? So it might make sense that before simulation of the described scene can take place, there must be a phase during which the understander deals with the grammar of the sentence to arrange its part into sensible assemblies. But on the other hand, couldn't it be that as we process words incrementally, we also evoke embodied simulation incrementally? That is, could it be that we mentally simulate as each word comes in, while we're still trying to parse a sentence into a coherent whole? Let's apply this idea to the garden path sentences we saw earlier. The lawyer cross-examined by the prosecutor confessed. When you hear the lawyer, you might conjure up a simulation of a lawyer, though perhaps an unspecific one. Then comes the word cross-examined. You got your mental representation of a lawyer, and although the current parse you have for the sentence is incomplete, as it will later turn out incorrect, you go ahead and attempt to mentally simulate the lawyer standing in front of a witness stand, cross-examining. Whom the lawyer is cross-examining is unclear, still at this stage. So your embodied simulation might well omit details of what the cross-examinee looks like. Or you might simulate a prototypical or stereotypical cross-examinee. But when you then get to by the prosecutor, your parsing machinery grinds to a halt, and so does your simulation machinery. And so on, once you collected enough information to reparse the sentence as it was intended, the lawyer is in fact the cross-examinee. You can resimulate the described scene, this time with the lawyer on the witness stand, rather than in front of it. So do you simulate early and often, or late and infrequently? To answer this question, we again need to find a way to detect embodied simulation over the course of sentence processing. To answer this question, we again need to find a way to detect embodied simulation over the course of sentence processing. In fact, there is a very widely used methodology known as self-paced reading that allows us to do just this. There are different variants, but the basic idea is that you display parts of a sentence on a screen one at a time. The catch is that the parts don't appear automatically. You have the person reading the sentence perform some action to make each piece appear on the scene. Typically, self-paced reading uses a button, so a participant in an experiment might push the button and see the, and then push the button again to see rabbit, and again to see monkey, and so on. This is self-pacing. Self-paced reading is often used to detect where people have trouble processing sentences. Logically, the more difficult it is for a person to understand a given word that has just appeared on the screen, the more time they need to understand it, and as a result, the longer they will take to press the button to display the next word. Self-paced reading can also be adapted to tell us about embodied simulation. A researcher at the University of Rotterdam used the device we discussed earlier, the knob, which, as you might recall, is a very small device, 1 inch in diameter, and that you turn to respond to stimuli. The knob can be configured so that in order to see the next part of the sentence you're reading, you rotate the knob a very small amount, just 5 degrees. The next thing about the knob is that you can have people rotate it either clockwise or counterclockwise. What the Dutch researchers did was to have people use the knob to pace their own reading of sentences that describe manual rotation either clockwise or counterclockwise. For instance, the 2 sentences below describe actions involving rotation of the dominant hand in the opposite direction. And here we have 2 sentences with a slash after each word, and there is presented with a 5 degrees rotation on the knob. With sentences describing clockwise or counterclockwise motion and responses involving one of the same 2 types of motion, you can measure whether there are compatibility effects between the sentence meaning and the manual response direction. This is a lot like the action-sentence compatibility effect, except that measurements are taken not after the sentence is over, but right in the thick of it. The findings from this study were quite clear. When people were rotating the knob in a compatible direction, they turned the knob faster. For instance, in the example above, if they were rotating the knob clockwise, this was compatible with the described action of turning a key in the ignition to start a car. So they responded faster after the word started. But when they were turning the knob in an incompatible direction, they were slower. Crucially, as you can see in the depicted figure 33, this was only true of the rotation actions the readers made directly after the verb, for instance, start. When they saw the words before or after the verb, they showed no difference, regardless of whether the knob was being turned in the same direction as the object in the sentence. The graph in figure 34, also depicted here, depicts the results more clearly. What you see there is an average time it took people to rotate the knob either clockwise or counterclockwise while processing different regions of a sentence. The two lines depict cases where the direction of rotation implied by the sentence matches or mismatches the direction of the action. The participants makes to see the next part of the sentence. As you can see, there's basically no difference at any of the regions except in the verb region. If you look at the sentences on the previous page, you can see why this would be. The relevant verbs are started and open. Neither of them necessarily describes rotation in a particular direction on its own. But the stuff before the verb in each sentence sets up the context such that when the verb appears, it's pretty clear that the sentence describes rotation in a particular direction. So the big takeaway point here is that as soon as a verb appears that implies manual rotation in a particular direction. People mentally simulate rotation in that direction. This answers our question about incrementality. People do not wait until the end of a sentence to start stimulating. They do it early on, in the middle of the utterance. But this result is actually quite revealing for three other reasons as well. First, this effect is produced by words like open and start that don't in and of themselves denote rotation in any particular direction. They only have these meanings in the right context. And yet, it's when people see these particular words that the evidence for embodied simulation of hand rotation shows up. So it seems like it's not what the words mean in isolation that guides people in their incremental simulation. Instead, people are calculating what the words describe in the particular context of the sentence they appear in, and use this to run embodied simulations. A second key point is that the place where embodied simulation effects showed up in this study is right at the point in the sentence where it became clear that the sentence was about rotation in one direction or the other. If so, this suggests one way in which simulation is less than completely incremental. Do people simulate as early as possible, whenever the sentence gives them reliable information about something to be simulated? We get a clear answer from some additional work conducted with a knob by the same researchers. They conducted another study to see whether words other than verbs can produce the embodied simulation effects they observed. So they created sentences that didn't imply rotation in one direction or the other until well after the verb. Some examples are below. As you can see, it's only on the very last word of the sentence that you can infer which direction the carpenter had to rotate his or her hand to turn the screw. And sure enough, the researchers found the same mismatch difference, but this time it only appeared on the last word of the sentence and not on words preceding it, including verbs like turn. So it appears that whenever in a sentence you get distinguishing information about a simulation, you go ahead and mentally simulate whether the key word is a verb like started, describes the action, or an adverb like loosely, that's only, well, loosely associated with it. The carpenter turned the screw. The boards had been connected too tightly. The carpenter turned the screw. The boards had been connected too loosely. A finally important outcome of this study is the finding that the simulation effect is ephemeral. By the time the reader is on to the next part of the sentence, there is no measurable difference between the matching and mismatching conditions. This last point is worth thinking a little more about. Why would it be that the measurable simulation of rotating your hand in a particular direction would appear immediately A final outcome of this study is the finding that the simulation effect is ephemeral. By the time the reader is on to the next part of the sentence, there is no measurable difference between the matching and mismatching conditions. This last point is worth thinking a little more about. Why would it be that the measurable simulation of rotating your hand in a particular direction would disappear immediately after the verb? Here's one possibility. If you look at the sentences about starting cars and opening water bottles, you'll see that the part of each sentence immediately after the verb indicates the thing that the action was performed on. At this point, people reading the sentences don't appear to be representing manual rotation anymore. Why not? Maybe what's happening is that with each new word that comes in, you shift your attention to whatever the new information is that it's providing, and construct the appropriate embodied simulation. For instance, in the sentences above, the first word after the verb is the. Maybe what the tells you is to prepare to mentally simulate some objects, perhaps motor aspects of how you interact with it, or other aspects like its visual appearance, tactile feel, and so on. By contrast, if instead of the next word were something related to the manual rotation described by the verb, like slowly, perhaps you would be more likely to continue simulating the rotation as you processed it. As it turns out, the knob has something to tell us about this too. What the knob handlers did was to come up with new sentences to present to readers, who once again knob their way through the sentences. The sentences were similar to those in the previous experiment, except that they now had a specific word after the verb, an adverb. There were two types of adverb as shown in the sentences below. One type described the manner of the action, such as rapidly, slowly, or quickly, as in the first sentence below. The other described an aspect of the mental state of the person performing the action, like hungrily, obediently, or happily. He was craving a juicy pickle on the shelf. He found a closed jar which he opened rapidly. And then the same sentence ending with he opened hungrily, which is more of an adverb. They figured out that if the adverb was about the person's mental state and not the action itself, then this would draw readers' embodied simulation away from the rotation. But if the adverb was about the action, then they should continue simulating the action. What they found was that adverbs that describe the manner of action, like rapidly, sustain focus on the embodied simulation on the action itself, even after the verb. People were faster to perform matching than mismatching actions on both the verb and the subsequent adverb. But with adverbs like hungrily, which pertain to the emotions or mental states of the person performing the described action, people showed a significant match-mismatch difference only for the verb and not the subsequent adverb. In other words, how long you keep simulating action depends on whether the following words draw your attention away from that aspect of the described scene. So the knob studies tell us a lot about incremental simulation. People activate simulation incrementally. They do so in a context-sensitive way. It only shows up when a word in its particular context implies something to simulate. And they do so opportunistically, as soon as reader have reliable information to simulate. They do so regardless of whether the word has finally cemented it as a verb or an adverb or whatever. And finally, this simulation is ephemeral. It disappears quickly when a sentence transitions to a different content to be simulated. This evidence is enlightening and compelling, but again, we'd be most comfortable with these conclusions if we found convergent evidence using a different method. Fortunately, a different strand of research addresses the temporal dynamics of simulation as well, even though it started out focusing on a very different issue. This work came out of my lab. We wanted to know whether embodied simulation works the same in other languages as it does in English. A graduate student, Manami Sato, was doing research on Japanese, and she tried to replicate one of the seminal experiments on visual simulation. This was the one where people read sentences that mention objects and imply that they have certain shapes. For instance, each of the sentences below implies a different shape for the egg, namely the shape to its right. Nana put the egg in the fridge. Nana put the egg in the pan. I imagine you don't need a picture here. The original finding using English sentences was that people were faster to press a button saying that the depicted object had been mentioned in the sentence when the shape in the picture matched the one implied by the sentence. We tried to replicate this finding with Japanese sentences, expecting to find the same thing. There is no reason to think that Japanese should be less coercive in driving simulation of object shape than English is. But we were surprised to find that there was no difference in participants' reaction times, regardless of whether the picture of the object matched the one implied by the sentence At first we were baffled, so we looked closely at the sentences we used as stimuli in Japanese. They looked like this. Nana ga rezoko nanaka ni tamago o ireta. Nana ga huraipan no naka ni tamago o ireta. Then it struck us that we were testing for an embodied simulation at the wrong time. After all, Japanese sentences have a different word order than the English ones. In English, the verb like put usually comes in the middle of a sentence, and the direct object whose shape we were testing for like egg comes later. So if you prove simulation using a picture as this method does at the end of the sentence, you're getting at people's simulations right after they discovered what shape the object should have. But in Japanese, the order is reversed. As you can see from the sentences above, in Japanese, you build up an idea of what objects are where and what shape they have pretty early in the sentence. By the time you read the word tamago, meaning egg, you have a pretty good idea what shape it has. You already seen that's in the pan or in the refrigerator, and eggs don't tend to be placed in pans intact any more often than they are cracked open into refrigerators. So when the Japanese reader finally gets to the verb ireta, meaning put, at the very end of the sentence, there is no need to perform any more visual simulation of the shape of the object. Instead, this verb might trigger simulation of something else. For instance, it might yield motor or visual simulation of the action of putting the egg in the described location. So we made a little modification to the methodology, changing where in the sentence the picture appeared. If our explanation was right, then moving the picture earlier in the sentence so that instead of coming at the end, it directly follows the object noun. This would lead to a difference between the matching and the mismatching pictures. So we conducted another experiment using the same kind of sentences, but this time people saw the picture before the verb and had to decide whether it had been mentioned in the sentence. So for instance, they would see Nana ga rezoko nonna kani tamago ireta. Nana put the egg inside the fridge. Nana ga huraipan nonakani tamago ireta. Nana put the egg in the pan. When we looked at the results, all of a sudden, the mysteriously missing effect was back. Japanese speakers responded faster to the images when they matched the shape implied by the sentence than when they didn't. So we conclude several things from this. As the knob show, people simulate details, in this case object shape, even before getting to the end of a sentence. They do so in a not a word-specific way, but use the word plus the context. And that simulation is short-lived because any sign of it disappears by the end of the sentence. The implication of these results is that on occasion you might mentally simulate one thing because you're pretty certain that you know what's being described, only to have to revise your simulation entirely when some new word appears later in the sentence. In other words, maybe you sometimes get led down a simulation garden path. For example, imagine you are a Japanese speaker and you read Nana go rezoko no naka ni tamaga o otoshita. Nana dropped the egg inside the fridge. And the other one is Nana rolled the egg on the pan. These sentences imply unusual shapes for the objects in the mentioned locations. You expect an egg in a pan to be broken, not capable of rolling, but because in Japanese the verb comes at the end of the sentence, you don't actually know until the very last word that the shape of the object is the unexpected one. That the egg in the fridge is actually broken, or that the egg in the pan is actually intact. We already know from the experiments above that prior to the verb, people have constructed embodied simulations of the shapes of the objects. In order to understand sentences like Nana rolled the egg on the pan, when the verb appears at the end, people might actually have to construct an alternative simulation of the object. One with a different shape. To test this, we use sentences like these, which implied one shape up to a point, and then switch it at the end and presented the picture at the end of each sentence. A bit tricky to understand that last. We thought that if people were really switching back and forth from one simulation to the other, then they should be faster to respond to an image matching the final shape implied by the unexpected verb. And sure enough, when we looked at the results, the mismatch effect was back. People responded faster to the shape depicting the final implied shape of the object than to the one that would have seemed more reasonable just one word before. In other words, people quickly correct and revise the embodied simulations they construct when new information overrides the assumption they had made previously, and that they had based the previous simulation on. In a word, so people process sentences incrementally. But let's zoom down for a second to a smaller scale. When exactly does the simulation start? We already know that a word in the right context can lead people to simulate. But do people wait until the word is over, or do they start making guesses early on with only partial information? This is a question that operates over an extremely tight time scale. A monosyllabic word often lasts no longer than a couple of 100 milliseconds. So we need a tool that allows us to make inferences about what people are simulating in real time. And a very useful tool for this purpose is, again, eye tracking. As we saw earlier, we can track how people's eyes move to images in their environment while they're listening to words and sentences, and use what they look at, and when as an index of what they were thinking, and when. When it comes to words, people don't wait a tenth of a second to look at what they think the word is about. Suppose you have someone looking at pictures of a number of different objects, say a beetle, a beaker, a speaker, and a carriage, like in the depicted figure 37. If you have that person listening listen to a sentence about one of the objects, like pick up the beaker, while you're tracking the eye movements, you'll see that they look more at the beaker than the carriage or the speaker. That might not be surprising. After all, the person is being told to interact with the beaker. So as long as they know what a beaker looks like, they should look at it more than other objects. The interesting thing though is the timing of that increased looking. Just after the beginning of the word, even before the K in beaker, people are already starting to make increased eye movements to the beaker. What's more, the clever thing about this particular experimental setup is that the first couple sounds of beaker, namely the B and the E, are ambiguous between beaker and beetle. And as a result, people actually look more at the beetle early on, to at least right after they heard the beginning of the word beaker. Then as soon as they hear the K, they stop looking at the beetle. That means that they're making guesses as soon as they start hearing a word about what in the environment it could possibly refer to. But when people start to look early on in a word at things in the world that they think it refers to, how do they know what to look at for a word that starts B? How do they know that it's the picture on the top left or bottom right that are most likely to be the thing they're hearing about? That is beetle and beaker. Most obviously, they have to be predicting what the rest of the word will be, starting with just the first couple of sounds. This is by itself quite a task, but there's a deeper issue beyond that. Assume you predicted that word, your hearing is going to be beaker. How do you know which image depicts something that could be called by that name? Presumably, people do this by accessing some kind of perceptual knowledge. Knowledge about what beakers and beetles look like. And we can actually detect whether this is what's going on by looking at the kinds of mistakes people make in a task like the one with the beaker and the beetle, but modified slightly. Suppose you hear a sentence that mentions a frog, but there isn't a frog on the screen in front of you. There is, however, a piece of lettuce along with a couple of other things. A guitar, a rope, a strawberry. In this case, all other things being equal, eye tracking shows that you're most likely to look at the letters more so than other objects. But if instead you hear a sentence about a snake, then you're most likely to look at the rope. Why the letters in one case and the rope in the other? As you may have surmised, the remarkable finding is that people tend to look at things that look similar to the thing that was mentioned, or at the shape, as in the case of the snake and the rope. This is important because it means that while you're hearing a word, you're already activating the perceptual details of the things you think it refers to. And then, at this point, you might have noticed that some of the results we've reviewed seem to contradict one another. On the one hand, we've seen again and again that at the end of sentences, people act as though they're mentally simulating. For instance, the very first knob study, described back in chapter 4, show that when people make judgments about the meaningfulness of sentences after reading them by twisting the knob one way or the other, they do so faster when the action described by the sentence is in the same direction. Here you see how important directionality is for the understanding of words. But on the other hand, in this chapter we've seen that simulation is incremental and ephemeral. Although you conjure up embodied simulations of elements mentioned in a sentence as you go, this simulation is soon obscured by simulation effects produced by the next informative piece of language in the sentence. If a simulation that emerges during a sentence subsequently disappears when you get to the next word, then why do we see simulation effects at the end of sentences? The short answer is that we don't know. I mean, we know that when the last word in a sentence provides key information that leads to a viable simulation, people are going to be simulating that detail at the sentence's end. But we don't know why several seconds after the end of a sentence, some simulation effects show up again, even ones that have ostensibly flared up and then been extinguished over the course of the sentence. But just because we don't know doesn't mean we're at complete loss for ideas. For example, one relatively popular hypothesis is that you go through several steps during sentence processing. There's a first stage where you build up the pieces of the sentence from what you hear or read. And there is a second stage where you resimulate what it was that you were supposed to simulate. This second stage is often referred to as a wrap-up, because you're wrapping up what the sentence was ultimately about. So wrap-up could be why we see simulation effects both during a sentence and after a sentence. Early incremental simulation is driven by the current and immediately preceding language, while wrap-up is a slower process that reruns some key parts of the incremental simulation. What would lead people to perform wrap-up simulations? Perhaps they serve a purpose. You appear to go through a lot of twists and turns in simulating as you read or listen to a sentence. But sentences often convey overriding ideas that you don't want to jumble up. So once you're certain you come to a viable interpretation of a sentence, perhaps a recap is in order. You could use wrap-up for a number of more specific purposes. For one, a wrap-up simulation might be something relatively reliable you can use to update your beliefs about the world, whereas you might not want to rely on the ephemeral simulations that you experience in the middle of a sentence for this purpose. For the same reason, you might prefer to use wrap-up over the short-lived, ephemeral, and often ultimately incorrect simulations produced during a sentence. When preparing to act in response to an utterance, the appropriate response generated in the middle of a sentence, like "there's a bomb in my office," might not seem so appropriate when you get to the end of the sentence. Clip art collection. Wrap-up simulations might be particularly well suited for these purposes, not just because they're more likely to be accurate. They can also, in principle, last longer than simulations performed during the course of sentence comprehension, because they're less likely to be updated or changed on the basis of subsequent input. Holding a stable and likely accurate simulation firmly in mind for a while could be quite useful if you want to use your understanding of an utterance for some purpose. But for now, the role of wrap-up is at best speculation. The relation between what you do while you're processing a sentence and the embodied simulations you perform subsequent to it is an area ripe for future study. Say it ain't so. But the process of understanding a sentence doesn't necessarily end with the wrap-up. You probably had the experience of coming to the end of the sentence only to have to do more mental work to figure out what the sentence actually means. For instance, suppose you're hiring and you're scanning through a letter of recommendation for a particular candidate. When you come upon a sentence like this, I can't recommend this candidate any more strongly. Your first impression might be that the recommender is offering their strongest support for the candidate. That is, that she can't recommend the candidate any more strongly because there are no words strong enough to express how unfathomably amazing the candidate is. Listen to this, Pelle. But upon further reflection, you might be struck by the possibility that the recommender is actually saying that she can't recommend the candidate any more strongly because she doesn't know much about the candidate or that there is nothing good to say about him. The point here is that the process of understanding a sentence often continues dynamically even after the last word is heard or the last punctuation mark read. Nowhere is this more obvious than in negated language. So far we focused only on language describing purportedly factual scenes. But every language in the world also provides means to describe events that didn't happen, won't happen, or aren't happening. English carries several sorts of negation in its grammatical arsenal. An entire sentence can be negated like so: the shortstop didn't hurl the softball at the first baseman. Parts of a sentence can also be individually negated. No shortstop hurled the softball after the first baseman, or the shortstop hurled not one softball at the first baseman, and so on. Negation is of special interest to accounts of language understanding that uses simulation, because it is particularly challenging case. Even if there is convincing evidence that people perform embodied simulation when understanding language about things happening, like softball players throwing things at each other, it's not immediately obvious how the same process would apply to language about things not happening, like softball players not throwing things at each other. What, if anything, do people mentally simulate when confronted with negated sentences? One leading idea is that negation is processed through several stages. When you hear or read a negated utterance, the first thing you do is to mentally simulate the counterfactual scene. That is the scene described as not true. So, for instance, in understanding your birthday presents aren't on top of the refrigerator, the counterfactual scene is the false one, where presents are in fact on top of the refrigerator. But somewhere else. The counterfactual scene is the false one, where presents are in fact on top of the refrigerator. But this counterfactual simulation is subsequently suppressed or modified, which leads to the second proposed stage in the course of processing. This is the activation of the factual scene, the scene that the sentence is saying is actually true. In our example, This would mean a simulation of the presence not on top of the refrigerator, but somewhere else. As you can see represented schematically in figure 38, also depicted. Sorry about these pictures. So let's first look at whether this is actually what people do. And then we can try to understand how it would allow people to understand negated language. So how can we tell empirically whether people are first performing a counterfactual and then a factual simulation? The simplest approach would be to use the familiar methods to assess simulation, but to present the critical stimuli at different times in processing. Logically, we should see effects of the counterfactual simulation being activated first, and then the factual one. We'll start with some studies that address what happens immediately after the sentence, and then turn to what happens in the second following. Work by German psychologist Barbara Kaup, and her colleagues used a method very similar to the one described in the study of Japanese to look at what happens right after the sentence. They first presented people with a negated sentences, like there was not an eagle in the sky, or there was not an eagle in the nest. Which mentioned entities, the eagle in this example, that could take on different shapes. Then, 250 milliseconds later, the experiment software displayed a picture depicting that same entity in one of the possible shapes. The question was which image people would process faster. With affirmative sentences, we've already seen the outcome. There was an eagle in the sky produces fastest responses to the flying than the sitting eagle. What about with negated sentences? If people first simulate the counterfactual scene and then the factual one, then at this very early time, just a quarter of a second after the sentence disappeared, we would predict faster responses to images matching the shape of the object implied in the sentence's counterfactual situation. That is, of the flying eagle in this case, than when they did not. And this is what Kaup and her colleagues found. If the sentence tells you that there was not an eagle in the sky, you nevertheless simulate a flying eagle. There's other evidence pointing to this same conclusion that comes from a different methodology, a method called semantic priming. Rachel Giora and her colleagues had participants first read a sentence of one of the three types. An affirmative sentence containing a priming word, like sharp below, a negated version of the same sentence, or an antonym sentence, an affirmative sentence using an antonym of the priming word, like blunt. These are actually translations of the original sentences, which were all presented in Hebrew to Hebrew native speakers. Affirmative, this instrument is sharp. Negated, this instrument is not sharp. And antonym, this instrument is blunt. People were supposed to indicate that they had understood each sentence by pressing a button, and 100 milliseconds later they saw a sequence of characters that either formed a word or did not. Their job was to decide if this sequence of characters was an actual word in their language. So they were performing what's called a lexical decision task. In the critical case, the target word was a real word that was either related to the priming word, piercing for example, or unrelated to it, like glowing. What Giora and her colleagues found was that affirmative sentences lead to faster responses to the related prime words than unrelated prime words. This isn't surprising. We know from lots of studies on semantic priming that words are processed faster after other words that have related meanings. Interestingly, though, the negated sentences did the same thing, suggesting that even when a word appears in a negated sentence context, it still activates mental representations of its meaning. And what's more, we know that this priming is in negated sentences is not due to the factual situation where the instrument is blunt being activated, because in the antonym condition, the related words were not responded to any faster than the unrelated words were. That is, just activating the idea of bluntness does not prime the word piercing, but not sharp does prime the word piercing. But not sharp does prime the word piercing. This suggests that the effect in negated condition did not result from activation of the factual situation, but of the counterfactual situation. Now, this finding alone doesn't necessarily mean that people are performing embodied simulations when they process negated sentences. It could just be that the word sharp makes you respond faster to the word piercing, because their meanings are related, regardless of what embodied simulation you do or don't perform. And you would be quite justified in thinking this, but it does at least overlap with the previous study. The one with the eagle not in the sky, in showing that in negated sentences, the counterfactual situation is indeed accessed right after the sentence is over. So these very different studies both provide evidence in favor of at least the first part of the hypothesized two-step process. Is the factual situation mentally simulated text? Mental simulated next? To know, we need to probe people's embodied simulation a little later on. The two studies we just looked at presented the image or word 250 and 100 milliseconds after the end of the sentence, respectively. But if you wanted to know what was happening farther down the line, you might present the image 750 or 150 milliseconds after the end of the sentence. This is what Kaup and her colleagues did. they created sets of sentences, like the ones in figure 39, which again mention objects that could be in different states. They again had people read a sentence and then push a button to indicate they understood it. Another depiction here, figure 39. They again had people read a sentence, then push a button to indicate they understood it. And here we have the umbrella was closed, the umbrella was not open, the umbrella was open, the umbrella was not closed. This button press then triggered the presentation of an image on the screen of the object in one of those two states. But they introduced a delay of 750 or 1500 milliseconds before each picture in figure. What they found was exactly in keeping with the two-step account. What they found is depicted in figure 40. You see how long it took people to respond to the picture. On the far left is the outcome from Karpi's original study, where the delay before the image appeared was 250 milliseconds. As you recall, people responded faster to the counterfactual image, but at the 750 millisecond delay, there was no difference between the factual and counterfactual images. And by 150 milliseconds, the trend had reversed itself. People were now faster to say that the factual image had been mentioned than the counterfactual one. This is pretty compelling evidence that when you process a negated sentence, you first construct a simulation of the counterfactual scene and then move on to the factual one. This seems like a tremendous amount of work to do just to understand a sentence. What's it all good for? It's possible that each part of the process serves specific functions. The factual component seems like it ought to be the most important, because in a way it's like a wrap-up simulation. It encodes the critical information that would allow the understander to act appropriately. If someone tells you that your birthday presents aren't on top of the refrigerator, you shouldn't expect it to be on the refrigerator, and you shouldn't look there for it. You might instead look for it elsewhere, or ask the speaker where it is. But if it is correct that the factual simulation does this work, what good is the counterfactual simulation? First, it could be part of the process that allows you to determine what the factual situation actually is in the first place. By phasing out and suppressing your simulation of the counterfactual scene, for instance, the present atop the fridge, you can ensure that the factual simulation that you end up constructing is inconsistent with what the speaker intended. Namely, it has to not have whatever the negated properties of the counterfactual scene are. A second possible function of the counterfactual simulation is that by going through the counterfactual phase, you might actually take a particular type of trajectory in understanding and utterance that is different from what you would do if you just heard an affirmative sentence describing the same factual scene. Compare, the umbrella isn't open, with the umbrella is closed. You might end up with the same factual simulation in processing these two sentences.